In The Last Remains is book 15 of the Ruth Galloway mysteries, and Ruth is called in when a body is found in the wall of an old house, and it turns out to be a student who died 20 years ago, and she's drawn into the case, which of course also brings it into the orbit of DCI Nelson. So yes, been 15 books now since Ruth and Nelson met in the Crossing Places, and I always thought they would be sort of an interesting pairing, and that they're opposites in lots of ways. Ruth's an academic. She works in a university. She always says the questions are more important than the answers. Nelson is very much, sees himself very much as a practical police officer, and he definitely wants answers. But of course, as anyone will know who's stuck with me through all 15 books, they have a very complicated relationship. But I think as an investigating duo, they are quite interesting, because Nelson is quite impatient, and he goes after the truth, and that's helpful sometimes. Sometimes he breaks a few rules along the way. And Ruth is much steadier, but she, I think, if you add into the mix Cathbad, their friend, who's a druid, he probably adds a slightly spiritual, otherworldly aspect, where he might suddenly go off on some strange tangent, and he does that in The Last Remains, much to everyone's concern, really. So I think probably you have to maybe see it as the three of them by now, by book 15. They cover different aspects of it. Ruth very much intellectual, Nelson going after the truth like a bull in a china shop, and probably Cathbad listening to the nature spirits. The Ruth books have to be set in Norfolk, really. It's part of it. It's a character in the story, really. So I think Ruth is Nelson, and Nelson is Ruth. Ruth is Norfolk, and Norfolk is Ruth. So I think they have to be set there as well. But all the settings are important to me. So the Brighton mystery is obviously set around Brighton, which is where I live. And then the books in the Harbinder Kaur series, it's not quite a series in the same way, but they're all set on the south coast of England. So place is really important to me in my books. Yes, so there's now a non-fiction book about Norfolk, and it really includes all the sort of strange little bits of history and legend and folklore that I couldn't quite fit into all the books, and also a little bit of my family history with Norfolk. So it's a place I know very well from childhood. My grandmother and my aunt lived there, and I spent many happy holidays on my aunt's boat. She had a boat which we used to drift up and down the Norfolk Broads, the sort of rivers through Norfolk. And my Auntie Marge always used to tell really great ghost stories. She was quite drawn to the macabre, let's say. And so that, I suppose, from early days, that was kind of linked to Norfolk. For me, those stories about strange river spirits and maybe even sort of gory murders that happened. There's a bridge across the Broads called the Acle Bridge, and a murder happened there. Marge always used to say that when your boat went under the bridge, a moisture would drop onto it, and you thought it was water, but it turned out to be blood. So there's always that slightly spooky aspect as well to Norfolk in my book. So the book Norfolk is really love letter to Norfolk, and it's all the other bits that I couldn't quite fit into the crime novels. Sometimes I just enjoy being with the characters so much. It's a bit of a shock to me to remember that I have to do a murder as well, and a whole plot around that. So The Great Deceiver starts with Max Mephisto going to meet a woman, as he often does. But in this case, it's his newborn granddaughter. So his daughter, Ruby, has had a baby. So that makes Max feel a little old, but he's also kind of delighted for Ruby. So on the way, he meets an old theatrical acquaintance called Ted English, who wants Max's help because Ted's assistant has been brutally murdered, and Ted thinks that the police, headed by Edgar, Max's great friend, will suspect him of the crime. And Max says he can't really do very much, but he does contact Edgar. And yes, there is a police investigation of this horrible crime. It's happened in a seaside boarding house. So you get to meet all the slightly strange, slightly interesting people who live in this boarding house. There's an Italian opera singer who's not Italian. There's a woman who's a strong woman. There's a double act called Big and Small, and there was this magician's assistant who was murdered, and before long another assistant is murdered. And Max starts to realize that the trail leads back to a rather seedy group of magicians that he remembers from his time on the circuit. And one of them has become a television star. Of course, TV becoming a big thing now. Um, in 1966, which in England is remembered forever because it was the last year England won the World Cup, the only time and last time the English football team won the World Cup. So that does come into the story a bit. So, yes, so it leads Max back to this strange, sinister group of magicians, and this particularly sinister man who was always known as Pal, and who now has a rather strange TV show called Hug or Hit, where you sing, and if you're good, he hugs you. If you're bad, he hits you with a plastic hammer, and both are horrible. The Man in Black is my first and maybe only, who knows, collection of short stories, and it was a great deal of fun, I have to say. And somebody said, and I'm trying to remember who, but I can't, so you might well know, Jake, but somebody said a novel is like a marriage, but a short story is like an affair. And it's a little bit like that. So I've got these characters like Ruth and Nelson and Max and Edgar and Harbinder and her gang. And they're like marriages, I've been with them a long time, particularly Ruth and Nelson, maybe. And this is my chance to do something a little bit different. So you find out what Max was like as a young man when he first did one of his first theatrical gigs and he first made a woman disappear. You find out about Justice, who's the heroine of my children's books. You find out what she does as a grown-up. And you do find out a little bit more about Ruth and Nelson in a long short story. They go on a cruise down the Nile, which turns out to also be a murder mystery, very much Agatha Christie footsteps. But I was also able to do a couple of other sort of slightly, I suppose, things that I wouldn't have done in a full-length book. For example, there's a short story from the point of view of Ruth's cat, Flint, which I wouldn't have been able to get away with for a whole book, but it was really fun to sort of just be in Flint's mind, to think, well, what does Flint think about this all? We know he loves Ruth and her daughter Kate. We know he's not very keen on Nelson. What's he really been thinking all this time? So those little odd things were really fun, and there were sort of stories outside that universe. That there's one about some ancient footprints on the sand. There's one that's a kind of a bit of pastiche of Little Women. So all those things were really good fun. I couldn't sustain them for a whole book, but it was really fun to do the short stories. So Justice is the heroine of my school stories, which I don't think are available in the US, but they are in the UK and some other European countries, and they're for sort of 8 to 12-year-olds, and they're set in the 1930s, and they're about a schoolgirl who wants to solve crimes, very much based on my mum, who was a schoolgirl in a boarding school in the 1930s, hated school, always wanted to solve a murder, particularly a murder of one of her teachers, one has to say. So I really enjoyed writing these stories because in a bit they're a tribute to my mom, who was a very indomitable character. So in Justice Jones and the Etherphone, it's now, I think, 1946. So war is over in Europe. But it's Justice has grown up and she's a private detective. But the shadow of war is very much over everybody, and she becomes involved with a medium who uses an etherphone, which it's this really weird musical instrument, which sort of, it's got such a sinister, sometimes people call it the glass harmonica as well. It's got a really sinister tone, so that comes into the story. So that was a lot of fun to write that one, and I did something that I've never done before, and I wonder if I'll do it again, because Justice is talking on a public telephone, because in those days people often didn't have telephones in the house. So she's on a public telephone. You remember in the UK they were always bright red. So she was on the phone and she sees a poster for Max Mephisto being in a theatre, and it's the first time those worlds have crossed. And in the very last story in The Man in Black is called Ruth Galloway and the Ghost of Max Mephisto. So Ruth sort of intersects with Max's world. So I realized they are all living in the same universe. I probably was a bit late to realize that. The last word starts with Edwin, who is a character we first come across in Postscript Murders, which is the first book to feature, not the first Harbinder book, but the first to feature Harbinder and this particular cast of characters. There's Edwin, who's an 84-year-old ex-BBC producer. There's Benedict, an ex-monk. And there's Natalka, a Ukrainian carer. And so we catch up with them again in the last word. And it starts with Edwin reading the obituaries, something that he's very fascinated with. And he says it's not morbid at all. It's just life. He likes to read about these lives of people. And then he realizes there's a slight pattern of obituary writers dying before their subject. So that leads them into the murder, which is the murder of a local writer called Melody. And rather unfortunately for them, she has two children called Harmony and Minim. So you can see the theme there. There's a bit of a music theme in the book as well. So in investigating this murder, Edwin and Benedict go to a writer's retreat, which I had so much fun writing about, Jake. You know what these places are like, and all those sort of inner feelings I maybe had about writing retreats and teaching creative writing, which I also do, all come to a head in this rather sinister writer's retreat. And Harbinder Kaur is there to give them advice, rather irritated advice sometimes, because her friends are great private detectives, but they do have a habit of sort of breaking the rules and crossing the lines, and Harbinder often has to clean up after them. So that's the last word, which is about, as I say, about words. It's about books. It's about how they can be very, very deadly sometimes. It's really true that they are very different, probably even in sort of format, they're different. So I would say Harbinder is a detective, and she was a detective sergeant when we first met her in The Stranger Diaries. Now she's a detective inspector. And I would say she's my best detective, really. She's the best at it. She's really good at it. And she is quite... she's quite meticulous in following the rules and trying to do a good job. And I think if she ever met DCI Nelson, she'd be quite irritated with him, because I think he does break a few rules. And as I say, he's a bit impatient. So I think Harbinder's actually my best detective. She's very good at what she does. She knows how to organize an investigation. But of course, that means when I'm writing about Harbinder, I have to know how to do that myself. So I do have a police advisor called Graham Bartlett, who was an ex-chief superintendent, actually, in Brighton and Hove. So he does advise, and he says as well that Harbinder's the best, the only one he'd probably promote on his team. But it's quite tricky when you're a writer, writing about somebody who's good at the job, because of course your detective can't get to the truth very quickly. There has to be at least 300 pages of them getting it wrong. So that's quite hard when they're really good detectives. So I would say Harbinder's pretty good. The Harbinder books are different in that each chapter is from a different point of view. So that's interesting to do. And each chapter has a chapter heading, which I love as well. Bring back chapter headings. So whereas Nelson and Ruth, it's a bit of a double act between them. You see Nelson doing the police stuff, Ruth doing the archaeology. With Max and Edgar's in the police, and Max is a magician. So that's very different. But I think in Harbinder, we have probably the best detective. And I just have to stop her getting the crime too quickly. Say, for example, when Ruth is looking at something, she's an archaeologist and they can read landscape, which is such a fascinating thing. If you're listening to an archaeologist talk, my husband's an archaeologist, that they'll know the dips in the ground that could be a burial site, or could have been a wall, or could mean something. And even when you see the countryside from the air, you see, actually, when it's a very dry summer, as this one is turning out to be, you can see these lines where houses used to be. So I suppose maybe Ruth has that aerial view of landscape. And I think Nelson is very practical. He sees it in practical ways. With Edgar, I think police officers investigated very differently in the 50s and 60s, which is when those books are set. But I made him one of the first detectives to want to take photographs of the scene, which would have been considered quite an eccentricity then. So I maybe see his crime scene in sort of black and white photographs. I'm just thinking of this as we talk. But I think I probably do see it in a very, very structured way when I'm being Harbinder. One thing she always notices are shoes. She always says she always notices the shoes, and that's true in every book that she's been in. So I'm particularly focusing on the shoes when I'm being Harbinder, but equally when I'm being the other characters in the different. Edwin, he has great detective instincts, and in this book you sort of see him as a music lover, and he notices some things about sounds that perhaps the others don't notice. Partly is which idea I have in my head and who it's going to suit best, and I think there will there'll definitely be another book in the Max and Edgar series and the Brighton mysteries, and I think there'll be at least one more for Harbinder and her gang, really. I've got them in quite a good place at the end of this book, and Harbinder herself, she now has a girlfriend and a settled love life, but I think maybe there's a little bit more that the characters can do. So I think there'll be at least one more. I just have to think of exactly the right mystery for them, and just the way it's turned out, that series, that they've all been sort of slightly literary, Stranger Diaries and Postscript Murders, excuse me, and Bleeding Heart Yard, and now The Last Word. So I just have to find the right mystery for them, but I think there will be at least one more. In The Frozen People, we meet Elly Dawson, who is a detective. She lives and works in the East End of London. She has been married 3 times. She has one grown-up son called Finn, who works for a British politician. And Elly works for a cold case unit. And the joke amongst their team is their cases are so cold, they're frozen. So they're known as the Frozen People. But actually, what we find out within the first few pages of this book is their cases are so cold because they go back in time to solve them. They work with a brilliant Italian physicist who works at Imperial College in London, and she has worked out a way to travel in time. And when we meet them, the team have traveled in time, but only for a few years back. The most they've gone back is a decade or so. But Elly is asked by a politician, very high up politician, incidentally, the very one her son works for. She's asked to go back to 1850, to Victorian London. And she does so. She has to put on a lot of very uncomfortable clothes, and she heads off to freezing Victorian London in 1850. So that's Elly Dawson, and that's The Frozen People. Yes, I hope there will be a series. I've just finished writing book 2, which is called The Killing Time. The concept of traveling in time, well, you can go anywhere, can't you? Within there are rules, that some of which you set yourself. So it was a huge amount of fun to write. So I think there's quite a bit of mileage to be got out of Elly and the team. But I don't want people to be frightened off by the time travel either, because honestly, I do think that if you like Ruth and you like Harbinder, you will like Elly. I think she's in some ways quite a similar character, quite a strong woman. Has her insecurities, but she's a pretty strong woman. And it's fun to see a very modern feminist woman go back in time to 1850. I think that was something that really drew me to it, because I love 19th century fiction, and I've often wondered about writing a book set in the 19th century. But it was particularly fun to write about a modern person going back into the 19th century, so you could see it through her eyes, and also through what it felt like and what it smelled like, and what the clothes were like. And so I was interviewed about the book in Britain, and the interviewer said, Doctor Who, which is, as you know, is big long running series, Doctor Who has been on television for 60 years and he's never been to the loo. But as soon as you take Elly back in time, you tell us how she goes to the loo. But I always found that really interesting. Those little things about everyday life. How does she manage that? How does she cope with these big skirts? How does she cope with keeping clean? How does she eat? So all those? How does she speak? Because her English sounds very odd to them. She has to keep saying, "Oh, I'm from Hastings," which is a town on the south coast. Nothing wrong with Hastings, but it's the excuse she keeps giving. Oh, that's just because I'm from Hastings. So it was fun to write history, but through that sort of that gaze, really, through a modern gaze, and again, a sort of woman in what is patriarchal world, particularly the world she finds herself in, and just to see how she navigates that. You know, she's had 3 husbands, she's been divorced 3 times, but they all assume she's a widow and that they've died mysteriously. So she quite enjoys killing off her husbands